To introduce our keynote tonight, one of the things we take joy in is that our honors students, we have an extraordinary pride in our honors program, the Theodore Roosevelt Honors Leadership Program here, and the students have agreed to do the introductions. And to introduce Michael Cullinane is Ronnie Nakota. Ronnie?
Welcome, everyone. On behalf of myself, Dickinson State University, and the Theodore Roosevelt Foundation, and Dr. Michael McCullinane, it is a great pleasure that I'm here to introduce Dr. McCullinane. Before I get started with that, I would like to briefly introduce myself. My name is Veronica Nakota, but my fellow colleagues know me as Ronnie. I am a second year here at Dickinson State University, and it is also my second year in the Theodore Roosevelt Honors Leadership Program. I have experienced many new ideas of leadership with my time in the program. I have also had many new experiences like today, my very first in-person Theodore Roosevelt Symposium, and getting the opportunity to best introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Michael McCullinane. We want you to listen to a few of his own words. I provided the following questions to Dr. McCullinane, and these were his thoughtful responses. The first set of questions was, why history? Why can people find the value in their own lives from learning more about key figures such as Theodore Roosevelt? Dr. Cullinane explains, it was a high school teacher that encouraged me to interview my grandfather on video, which was then later showed to my class. My grandfather came to the United States from Italy in the 1920s through Ellis Island. His father never spoke English and resented assimilation, whereas my grandfather never wanted to speak Italian and joined the war efforts in 1941 in order to become American himself. He lived through the Great Depression and the so-called American century that followed. His life still fascinates me, but because in his hindsight, many of his views were at that time, and I disagreed with many of them, but I can say how they have developed and took shape, which is in real insight into the past. To summarize, real value probably starts at home for most people. It did for me anyway. The next set of questions is, what's a fact about Theodore Roosevelt that speaks to you personally, and why? Dr. Cullinane shares, Theodore Roosevelt managed to make friends with political foes. My first book is about American anti-imperialism and the fight to limit American power in the world. Roosevelt was the antithesis of this idea, and yet many of the anti-imperialists worked with him on other aspects of public policy. That seemed foreign to us today, where the mentality of politics is them versus us. If we're drawing lessons from Theodore Roosevelt's time, this perhaps is one of the greatest potential to heal divisions. Let's give a nice warm welcome to Dr. McCullinane.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. That was lovely, and thanks for asking such thoughtful questions. And it's a real pleasure to have a student introduce a lecture. I think it's wonderful, and I'm so pleased to be here. And I hope you'll bear with me for a few more minutes while I thank a few more people. One of the problems with introducing people, and I suspect President Easton will know this, is that no one thanks him. And yet, President Easton has been at the forefront. One second, Mary. President Easton has been at the forefront of driving a lot of change over the last 3 years, and well, I'll explain more why he needs a thank you, but maybe we'll give him the applause now, and I'll get to that. So in terms of thanks, there's two other people that deserve some thanks, and that's Rob and Melanie Walton, who have made a generous donation to DSU, and I know there'll be more talk about the Waltons' contribution, especially later in the program. But what I want to say is that they've brought a step change to DSU in terms of historical scholarship, and scholarship more generally, because the TR Center is really interdisciplinary in many ways. So I think that's really important, and they are recognizing that education and public engagement are critical to advancing our human knowledge. And at this moment, that's really important. The humanities sometimes don't get that attention, and the fact that it's getting it here is wonderful, and it should be celebrated. Professor Stacy Cordry is here. Steve Eason is a native. Professor Cordry is not, and she is the best ambassador for DSU. She's the reason why I am here, as well as all of the generosity of other people, and she deserves a major round of thanks as well. And there's the team at the TR Center, and I think many of them have been mentioned already, but I have to give my personal thanks to Chris O'Brien, who has taken over from Sharon Kilsner. And Sharon, you are going to be missed. And Chris, you are a wonderful replacement. Eric Johnson, Kelly Highland, I don't know where you are, but you are incredible. There you are. And William, William, you as well. I'm going to get to you in a second, actually, but the TR Center is an incredible resource. Professor Eason, or Dr. Eason has said that already, and everyone else has mentioned it, but I just want to reinforce that point here today. Okay, so one last thing about the people that are here. Professor Jeff Wells is back there, and he's joining me as the Johnson Chair here. Two historians, three actually. William Hansard is back there as well. He's also a historian. We have three historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, which I'm going to talk about today. So I'm sweating up here, wondering what my colleagues are going to think about my presentation, but I'm delighted to be here with a team of scholars which have expertise in this period. Jeff Wells is a scholar of populism and journalism in the Midwest. William is a scholar of labor and the circus, which is a really exciting topic as well, and I'm delighted to be here with them. Right, now on to the presentation. I'm told there's a clicker. Hang on. Okay. So I've been tasked with setting the scene today, which is not normally what I do. Normally I talk about all the research I've been working on, but what I'm going to do is try and set the scene and explain what the Gilded Age and Progressive Era is. And the period of Roosevelt's life fits into that quite neatly. I'm also here to deliver a lot of puns. We're talking about the field of play. I've talked about a team of scholars. There's going to be a lot of puns. Please forgive me for them now. But just like the rules of a sporting game, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era has boundaries. Politics, business, society, culture, all of that fits into this period kind of within those white chalk lines of a sports pitch. They mark out the borders, and I've been thinking a lot about this context for a long time now. Recently, I started a podcast. I'll admit it was largely because I was lonely during the pandemic. We were all there. The four walls of my home office were closing in, and I wanted to talk to my colleagues, my friends, and meet new people. So to do that, I started a podcast called The Gilded Age and Progressive Era, which asks scholars about their recent research, but also asks them, what is this thing called the Gilded Age and Progressive Era? Does it, if we took the chains out to measure, would it match reality, right? And I'm not sure we've gotten to the bottom of that yet. The Gilded Age and Progressive Era is less studied than the Civil War. It's less studied than World War II. However, I firmly believe that it is the most transformative moment in American history. Now, I would say that because I'm a scholar of that period. But I'm going to try and convince you today that it is critically important to how we understand our world today. That was the purpose of the podcast, to try and connect the past to the present. It's the purpose, I think, of history in many ways, and there's a big debate raging in the world of historians about that Theodore Roosevelt actually wrote quite a bit about. I should say that historians typically refer to the period, let's see if this works, there we go, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, largely between the years 1865 and 1920. Some go back to 1860, when the Civil War begins. Some stretch as far as 1929, to when Wall Street collapsed and the Great Depression occurred. But broadly speaking, this period that's presented on the board there, that is the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. We might quibble about the boundaries, but largely that's a consensus. Coincidentally, or interestingly, I suppose, if you add Theodore Roosevelt's lifetime to the span of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, it quite neatly overlaps the broad parameters. He's born in 1858, 2 years after Charles Darwin writes The Origin of Species, and he's dead in 1919. Just months before the ink is dry on the Treaty of Versailles. That ends, of course, World War I officially. And I should clarify that the Gilded Age and Progressive Era is a confusing term, and this might be an opportunity for some questions or some debate about whether this is an appropriate term to use for a period in American history. Gilded and progressive, or is it gilded, or is it two periods, gilded and progressive, or is it gilded and progressive one period? Well, I'll let you decide, but the term itself was coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner. They wrote a book of the same name that parodied the excesses of the period. Popularly, the idea of a Gilded Age refers to something that's coated in gold, right? So this image up here of someone who is taking gold leaf, applying it to a wood frame, and covering it up so it looks like it's worth more than it is. It's not solid gold, it's just covered in gold. Is that what Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner meant about Gilded Age, gilded anything? Or did they mean gilded gold? That you actually took gold and put gilding or gold leaf around that, making it doubly valuable and completely excessive. You don't need to gild gold. Turns out it's a Shakespearean term that they were drawing from, and I could speak to that a little bit more maybe as we go on. But the term itself is complicated. It's not that easy to understand what they meant by gilded. I've gone back to read the book recently. It's not a great book. It's not Twain's best work. And it's extremely confusing to understand what they actually meant. And I think that is a great opportunity for us to investigate the period. The progressive era, on the other hand, is quite straightforward. It simply refers to a period of reform. And actually, in many ways, that could be any time, because reform is happening always. But it has multiple meanings as well in some ways, because reform isn't one type of reform. There's reforms to American democracy in this period, like the direct election of senators, or there's reforms to the way we vote, most notably that women get the vote in this period, or at the very tail end of this period, at least anyway. And reform also comes in a number of ways, like consumer reforms. So there is the Pure Food and Drug Act, or there's corporate reforms, like the implementation and regulation of corporate monopolies. And there's sweeping social reforms, like the advent of settlement houses, which bring people of different communities into the same urban environment, in the same housing area. Or you can think about the way that taxation changed America, whether we're thinking about Henry George's single tax movement, or we think about the progressive income tax that eventually does come in and that we're familiar with. Now, I could go on about reform endlessly, and I'm sure that everyone in the room will have some idea of what reform sticks out in their mind during this period. Maybe it's women's suffrage, or maybe it's civil rights, or maybe it's the way that these reforms don't really match the reality of today, that either we've come very far or we haven't come far enough in terms of reform. But why separate the terms? The Gilded Age of excess or obfuscation happens alongside the progressive era. They're happening together. And because of that, historians more typically now use those two terms together. Not everyone, and I'm sure there'll be some debate amongst historians how it's used, but more and more I'm talking to historians that say that they use the term as a collective one, gilded and progressive, not two separate terms. And who knows, maybe you might have a better name altogether. I would love to hear them tonight. The British call this, of course, the Victorian Age, right, because of the monarchy. The French call it the Belle Epoque, or the fin de siècle. The Japanese also have a monastic term, which is the Meiji Restoration. So the United States is not alone in this period having a name, but maybe there's something global that we could come up with as well. But I wanted to get back to this idea of time, the very idea of time, actually. The Gilded Age and Progressive Era, what defines it is the shrinking of time and distance, much in the same way that we experienced it in the 20th and 21st centuries. So let me explain what I mean by that. For the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, it was the railroads and telegraphy that made shrinking possible. A journey from coast to coast before the 1860s took roughly 6 weeks. So if you look at the map on the left, that's the rate of railroad travel just after the Civil War. To go from New York to San Francisco roughly took 4 weeks. If you wanted to go further to Seattle, it would take you 6 weeks. The one on the right is the dramatic change after the 1880s, when there's the transcontinental railway and then there's further development. It takes only 3 days to get from coast to coast by 1930, and it hasn't changed since. If you want to get from New York to San Francisco, it still takes 3 days today. So that's a remarkable change, and you can imagine the revolution that wrought. And I guess today, if we're thinking about things, we might think about air travel. And we might dream about what comes next. How fast can we get to Australia, maybe in 20, 50, 100 years from now? But that change is quite dramatic for the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Telegraphy also shrinks the world. The mail before telegraphy required a human, an individual, to deliver mail. The telegraph allows messages to transcend human space and time by way of electricity. Correspondence and news traveled at the speed of light, and it transforms business, politics, and society in much the same way, I would say, that the cell phone or the internet has done in our time today. The revolution that we understand today in our own lives with jet travel or with the internet is very comparable to the life that, and so if you can straddle those ages, if you know what it was like before jet travel and before the iPhone, then you'll know what a revolution this is to time and space in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. There's several other changes that I'll talk about, but beyond travel and communication, the other most important change is mass production. And I think we might take this idea for granted today, or this transformation for granted today. In the early 19th century, consumer goods were in short supply. Most food, energy, and other materials, generally speaking, were created in home or localities. The rise of mass production in the factory transforms the country, and not only does it lead to the vertical integration of the advent of corporations and factories, it leads to a completely new marketplace as well. And the best example of this that I can give you is the Sears catalog, which is the sort of Amazon of its time, right? Americans could buy mass-produced goods from any location. Sears offered everything from cradle to grave, literally everything from cradles to graves and tombstones. Eventually, this leads to lines of credit and other schemes to get buyers, to buy, and it reshapes demand in the country. So we're not just talking about supply here, we're talking about demand and the rise of consumerism as well. And mass production transformed jobs. Factories obviously replace farms, not entirely, of course, but people are moving from rural areas to urban areas to get jobs in factories. And I think I could probably spend the whole lecture here talking about those changes and how it made revolutionized class and society, urban development, health. But I hope that some of the other speakers, I think other speakers will talk about how cities changed with sports becoming a major feature in cities and how a lot of that stems from this period's growth and development. All right, but I'll move on and I'll just talk about internal migration as well and migration as well. During this period, millions of people moved around the United States, but also many millions of people moved to the United States. We might think about the first wave of immigration in the early 19th century. It's a smaller wave than the second wave, but we're talking about Irish and Germans and Swedes coming to the United States and moving to places like North Dakota eventually, right? The second wave is larger, and it includes Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Poles, Russian Jews, and also Mexicans as well. The United States is demographically changing during this period, and it's closing its doors to some people as well. The Chinese are excluded almost entirely, and the Japanese are being excluded largely based on class, I would argue. These decisions on who to let in and who to exclude derive from racial ideologies that would forever transform the demographics of our country. And ideas about who is an American became a vicious issue by the end of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era that culminated in the end of unregulated migration to the United States, or immigration, I should say. And race relations are not a matter for immigrants only. African Americans endure the Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised voters and segregated society in this period. The very idea of separate but equal comes about in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era when the Supreme Court allowed New Orleans to segregate its streetcar trolleys in 1896. And also lynching becomes common practice, not only in the South, but in many northern cities as well, although the South there's much more in the South. And if we think about the geography of the United States at this time as well, it is changing dramatically. Literally, the states are changing dramatically. What is the United States? Well, if we think about it in 1861, there are 23 states in the Union. By the time Grant is president, there are 33 states. And by the time Roosevelt is president, there are 45. There is also a growing list of territories in the United States that are, as one Supreme Court justice said, domestic in a foreign sense. These include places like Alaska, Hawaii, Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico, all of which would become states. And it also includes places like Washington, D.C., and territories in the Caribbean and Pacific like the Guano Islands and Samoa. And it also includes conquered territories as well, places like the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. The United States, any way you measure it by this time, looks like a colonial empire. Now, why go over this history that I suspect many of you will know or have some idea of to a greater or lesser extent? I think it tees up Theodore Roosevelt's idea of a strenuous life. In his 1899 eponymous speech, Roosevelt preached about strife, toil, work, labor, danger, hardship. He makes the speech in Chicago. Now, if any city in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era knew about those things, it was Chicago. The city was made by industrialization. It was created by the railroads and settlement houses, by urban sprawl, immigration, and activism. Chicago also knew about unrest and about violence, about empire, poverty, about duty and thrift. Sport offers a metaphor for Roosevelt. To strive for an end in sport demonstrates the strenuous life. A strong performance on the pitch or in the court or in the ring symbolized the American spirit and exhibited one's willingness to struggle for an end. As Roosevelt says in the speech, if we're worth our salt, we will be glad of the chance to do it. Struggle was made for the sake of being in the arena, to quote an oft-quoted speech of Roosevelt's. But in sport, we might say it's for the love of the game. It's no wonder why we see stars like LeBron James write "man in the arena" on his sneakers, or Tom Brady names his documentary, his retrospective documentary, "In the Arena." Or why, I don't know if you saw recently, but Jordan Spieth, when he was announcing his comeback to golf, put a promotional video out there where he quotes verbatim much of that speech that Roosevelt makes about the man in the arena. And while I say that sport's a metaphor for life, it was also a real tangible part of Roosevelt's existence. At least some sports were anyway. And I hope we'll hear later on about those sports that TR doesn't like baseball. He's not crazy about, and he's not crazy about golf either. In fact, he tells Taft, he shouldn't be playing golf on the campaign trail. TR's favorite sport was tennis, and I was delighted to see out in the hall that there's a picture of the tennis court. I'm going to share one, but the one in the hall is far better, so I would encourage you to take a look at that later on. TR doesn't play tennis like Rafael Nadal. He doesn't glide across a clay court like a swan, not at all. He plays like a rhino, and he charges at his prey. And just like a rhino, and just like TR, they couldn't see very well. So they often run into things. Rhinos are known for running into trees and rocks. TR would run into doubles partners and sometimes the net. He didn't play with skill. He played with enthusiasm. And I think that says a great deal about how he approached life. Athleticism equaled enthusiasm. Sport was for the sake of it, and winning was nice, but it hardly mattered as much as exercise. Now, to round the bases and bring this full circle, how did sport and the idea of strenuosity lead to the political reformation that we call the Progressive Era? How did Roosevelt bring reform to the excesses of the Gilded Age? Well, he surrounded himself with men that would do this for him, and they were, I'm sorry to say, all men. They all had the same enthusiasm for sport and reform as TR did. Let me begin at the end of his administration. So you may have seen this photo before. It's a picture of the last day that TR is in office, March 3rd, 1909. And on his last day, he invites, I think it's roughly 35 of his sporting chums to come to the White House and have lunch. Each man played sport in some way with Roosevelt. Not all of them can make it, so sadly there's a few that aren't in this picture. But each of these men also tackled some part of the president's political agenda as well. It wasn't just all about sport. This is his so-called tennis cabinet. In the summer of 1902, the White House underwent a complete restoration, or complete renovation, I should say, which was the first time in more than a generation that the White House undertook this redesign. It created the West Wing, which is pictured there on the left. The West Wing was the first time that the president had a distinct working space that also brought in other elements of the office of the president. So the cabinet office, for example, is right next to the president's office. The president's office in this West Wing, anyway, is not the Oval Office. It's a modest room. It's about 15 by 15 feet. And all it has in it is the president's desk, a library, a chair. It's very modest. It's not what we would associate today with the Oval Office. It's pretty nice. It's got high windows and a fireplace. It's not, you would like it as your office, but it's not that grand Oval Office that we think of. Roosevelt could easily access the cabinet office. Just next to his office, there was 2 sliding doors, and he could enter the cabinet office to meet largely secretaries and Congress people there. And in the afternoons, Roosevelt spoke with the press for about an hour. And of course, having the press corps in the West Wing, that was the first time that that had ever happened. So he circulated largely around these three rooms until the tennis court. The tennis court was put there by Edith because she wanted her husband to get exercise and not just spend the whole day working. The tennis court became a really important place for business, though. Invitations went out to those that the president found interesting, and guests found that repeat invitations only went to those that played with the same enthusiasm that he had. One visitor remembered that the president played all the faster when rain set in. He insisted that he could get just as much exercise playing water tennis as he could playing water polo. And this again speaks to the idea that enthusiasm and exercise, that's the ultimate object of the game. So there was no use in stopping. Just keep going. Just play a different game. If it's raining, if it's snowing, whatever it is, just keep going. And when they played tennis, they played 6 sets. So if you're familiar with the modern game, men play 5 sets. And the women's game, they play 3 sets. The tennis court played 6 sets. So they were often out there for 2.5, sometimes 3 hours playing tennis. And it was almost always doubles. Everyone admitted fatigue after the game was over. And those that sustained wounds on the tennis court or in Rock Creek Park or horse riding they won the president's admiration. Now, you might see this in the picture here, but you can also see it in the picture out in the hall, and it is fantastic. The one in the hall, you can see that there's a 20-foot high tarpaulin that prevented prying eyes and allowed players to only glimpse very little bit of the outside world. You could barely see the Washington Monument from this tarpaulin. And the site did remind visitors that exercise was only part of the engagement. Roosevelt never allowed photos of the game, never allowed anyone to photograph him in a tennis costume. He believed the public would misconstrue the game as frivolity. But actually, the tennis court had a political purpose, and it was important to the administration as well. After the match, the players took tea in the president's office, and the moment Roosevelt finished his tea, one regular said that the president then began dictating letters. And then everyone noisily discussed whatever letter was being written. And it was the problems of the day being aired in an informal manner. The tennis court became a political forum, and players had unique access to the chief executive. Now, on average, the players were roughly the same age as TR, but you'll remember TR was the youngest American president. He was, when he took office, only 41. By the time the tennis court is there, he's 42. The average age of the players are 41 at the start. Some as young as 26. Some in their late 50s, I don't remember exactly, but most of them fall in around that late 30s, early 40s age. Now let's compare that to William McKinley, who's 20 years older and took up gardening when he lived in the White House. What I'd like to do today is talk about one group within the tennis cabinet. So this is part of a wider project that I'm working on. I cluster the 35 members of this cabinet into 5 groups. There's diplomats, there's the green team, there's lawyers, there's special agents, and there's wonks. And today I'm going to talk about the wonks. I've purposely picked this group. You may have heard of Gifford Pinchot. You may have heard of Henry Stimson. They're in that picture as well. But I wanted to talk to you about people that you haven't heard of, that you should have heard of, because they are really important. And we're going to look at 5 gentlemen that transformed the way the administration operated. Starting from left to right in the red circles is Lawrence O. Murray. Then there is Herbert Knox Smith. The gentleman just behind Roosevelt is James R. Garfield. The next one is Charles Patrick Neal, and the third is James Bronson Reynolds. I suspect you haven't heard any of them except for James R. Garfield, whose name bears a resemblance to an assassinated president. That's his son, actually. But most of those people you may not have heard of, and you should. So let's do a quick biography of each of them. James Garfield, as I mentioned, is the son of the assassinated president. He was there on the day that his father was shot. He was there comforting his father the day that he died. He's a lawyer, and he'll later be the Secretary of the Interior in Roosevelt's administration, but he's so much more than that. He's the first commissioner of the Bureau of Corporations. That is the forerunner of the Federal Trade Commission. And it is the first time that a bureau exists to take on corporate regulation and anti-monopoly lawsuits. It's Garfield that takes down Standard Oil, and he initiates the antitrust suits against many other companies. And Garfield was so adept at this that he and learned on the job. His first attempt at regulating the meat industry was a complete failure, but he learned his lessons and then took on Standard Oil. And he had set his bureau up for success by getting Herbert Knox Smith, this gentleman, in the succession plan. So when he moves off to the Department of the Interior later on, Herbert Knox Smith comes in to take his place. He's another regular as well at the tennis court, and he takes over and continues to pursue anti-competitive corporation. Most weeks, these two would spend about 2 hours at the White House playing tennis, 2 hours a week, that is. And then they did many treks through Rock Creek Park or horse riding. During these adventures, they talk shop with Roosevelt. They develop bonds of affection and trust, which are intense in the diaries if you read them. And I would love any questions about any of these individuals. I'm not doing any of them justice by saying that they did this one thing. They did so many things during the administration. I'm cutting it short to say that Garfield and Knox are just corporate regulators, but that's the most important thing that they do for Roosevelt. Others don't take to the tennis court as easily, and I have to thank Ryan Swanson for sending me on some research that he had done on his book called The Strenuous Life, which includes a story from Lawrence O. Murray and his first trip to the tennis court, which was not a pleasant one. He's a rather cantankerous person, actually, as I found out, Lawrence O. Murray, and he found himself embarrassed when he goes to Washington to play tennis with Roosevelt because he was completely unprepared. When it starts raining, the president says, let's go for a walk in Rock Creek Park, and Murray cannot keep up. He loses a shoe, I think, and he's a mile behind, and he finally gets back to the White House, and Roosevelt's not really impressed. But he vowed after that moment never to fall short of Roosevelt's expectations again, and he hires a personal trainer. Just think about that, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and you hire a personal trainer. I don't think that happened very frequently, but he builds his body in a way that Roosevelt might have said, I built my body, and he comes back again and again to the tennis court, and then he becomes quite a vigorous player. He also becomes one of the most influential and understudied bureaucratic revolutionaries in our nation's history. As a leading member of the Keep Commission, he investigated government waste and brought reforms to accounting, procurement, pensions, and structural organization. And I know everyone is like, ooh, this sounds amazing. Tell me more about bureaucratic revolutions. I know, it's not sexy, but it's transformative. And Roosevelt knows that what he is doing is absolutely transformative. He's the best example in Roosevelt's administration of efficiency and modernization, and the period is known for the efficiency movement and modernization. If we think about the Keep Commission as well, you may not know what the Keep Commission is, but it's designed to restructure American government. Every administration after Roosevelt's relies on the Keep Commission to restructure the government. In fact, the 9/11 Commission quotes the Keep Commission. So it's critically important to our nation's history. Charles Patrick Neal and James Bronson Reynolds, two figures that we have forgotten, and they're both pictured here. Neal is pictured on top. He's the commissioner for the Bureau of Labor before it becomes a distinct department in the cabinet. And he manages statistics that allow Roosevelt to make decisions about issues of the day, mainly around capital versus labor, but he's so much more than that as well. Reynolds, on the bottom there, is a New York settlement leader who joins forces with Neal to write a scathing report about Chicago meat packing houses. So you might know about Upton Sinclair and the jungle. Roosevelt doesn't entirely believe Upton Sinclair. Sinclair is a socialist, and Roosevelt sends two investigators to make sure that it's on the up and up, and that's James Bronson Reynolds and Charles Patrick Neal. They go to Chicago. They find pig carcasses going into latrines. They find no sinks in abattoirs, and they report back to Roosevelt, and that's what leads to the Meat Inspection Acts. So obviously critically important for consumer regulation. What follows is the Pure Food and Drug Act. When these two aren't playing tennis, they advise Roosevelt on all manner of other issues as well. Immigration, federal employment law, labor conditions in Panama. How is it that we don't know these men? Even the historians among us, I suspect, don't, and even historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. I'm looking at Jeff back there. He's shaking his head, which is good. It means I'm onto something. Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era don't know these people, and they should. Lawrence O. Murray alone, he's so obscure that his papers at the office of the Comptroller of the Currency have never been accessed. This guy has been dead for 90 years, and his papers haven't been accessed by researchers. I suspect that none of you know that we have an office of the comptroller of the currency, but we do. That's a thing. I don't know what it does either, so don't ask in the questions. Now, the reason why I speculate why we don't know who these people are is because the office of the presidency overshadows all others. Journalist Nicholas Lehman, who was writing in The New Yorker, once said that among the cruelties of popular political history is that almost everyone below the level of president winds up being forgotten. Now, I think that's an overstatement. We remember secretaries of state, and we remember presidential advisors, but we remember a few people in an administration, not all of them. And I think that with TR, his personality or celebrity is so huge that he's like a vacuum. He sucks all of the air out of the room, and we think about Roosevelt, and we don't think about the other people in the room. It's so loomingly immense that those people that are the closest to him during his administration, those that played tennis with him on a regular basis, that were in the White House daily, never got credit for their amazing achievements. And these are not faceless and nameless bureaucrats. They're charismatic personalities. Big ideas. They have huge ideas about how to transform the United States, and they have the same energy and boundless enthusiasm as Theodore Roosevelt. And success hinged on athleticism. It hinged on going to the tennis court or going to the park or riding horses. That's what gave them access to the White House. These are the architects of the progressive era. They made reforms to government work, to economic regulation, conservation of natural resources, civil rights, Native American allotments, foreign policy, the armed forces, global trade, and American democracy. We've let the aura of Theodore Roosevelt obscure them. Now, for some of the tennis court members, the reforms roll on after he leaves the White House. So I mentioned Henry Stimson. He's part of this group. You may know Henry Stimson is the architect of the American century. He's Taft's Secretary of War. He's the Secretary of State under Hoover. He'll be Secretary of War again under Franklin Roosevelt. So he's there, he continues his work, and others as well, like the French ambassador, Jules Jusserand, who's pictured in here as well. He stays in Washington for many years to come. In fact, until he dies, I think, in around 1933. But others left politics after the access dried up to the White House. The tennis court lasts only 6 years. It's gone after Roosevelt. Taft, as I said, was a golfer, and he disliked tennis, so he just simply had the court removed. It was gone after Roosevelt left. And TR's friends, like James Garfield or the conservationist Gifford Pinchot, they also begin to wither after Roosevelt's departure. Taft refused to give them access the way that Roosevelt had. And so the tennis cabinet is a rather short-lived thing. But within those 6 years, I would argue, the burst of strenuous activity, of sport, of enthusiasm and exuberance in the White House about what could be, the prospect for America, the reforms that could be wrought, absolutely reshaped this country. Thank you.
So interesting. Thanks for starting. So a couple of quick questions. I know the audience has questions for you too, but just want to start with Henry Stimson. What an extraordinary human being that was. So in World War II, for example, he saved Kyoto. One of the targets for the atomic bomb was Kyoto. He had a relationship with somebody who had been there, and he said, we're not going to bomb the most Christian city in Japan, and he saved it. And he was reluctant on atomic warfare altogether. He spans the whole century until almost, until Dwight Eisenhower. He doesn't sound to me like a strenuous man. So what happened to the advisors to Roosevelt who just didn't get on board with this strenuosity? Were they excluded? Were they marginalized? What happens?
So that's a great question. There's many people you might know from the administration that aren't pictured there. Elihu Root's not there, other secretaries from other departments, although there's not a lot of secretaries from departments there because they're political jobs. Some of these men are political. Stimson is. He ran for governor, and he was a district attorney before he comes to Roosevelt in the tennis cabinet. But these are sort of the next level below the secretaries. So there's a postmaster general in there, but there's not a secretary of state or a secretary of war. These are young men that are getting their start in their career. In fact, another really good example of a man who's very similar to Stimson is William Phillips, who you may or may not know, but was a really important figure in American foreign policy and diplomacy. He's the youngest member of the tennis cabinet. He's 26 years old, and he goes on to reshape the State Department in 1909. And so there are other people that are important, that are shaping policy, no question. But the wellspring of a lot of these ideas are coming from the tennis cabinet. The execution of those ideas is often coming from the secretaries or undersecretaries and the sort of official jobs that are then, Senate approved. Most of these are not Senate approved jobs. They're really informal advisors.
So in many senses, they're second-tier people, and they're young and ambitious, but you mentioned Murray and Jusserand, who both probably would have preferred not to be strenuous, but they determined to keep up with him, and they were able to do it, and they impressed him. There must have been people who were determined to do this who just didn't have the right stuff.
So there's loads of stories, and I'm sure Ryan has read some of them because he shared that Murray story.
Right.
But there are lots of stories like that where people don't keep up with Roosevelt, they fall behind, and they don't get invited back. There's actually one person in the tennis cabinet that Roosevelt didn't like, but he was physically phenomenal. George Washington Woodruff, who was Gifford Pinchot's right-hand man. He was a lawyer for the Forest Service, and Roosevelt disliked him. They met him and he said, I really don't like this guy. He said something out of turn and insulted Roosevelt somehow, but he kept on coming back because he was a former football player who coached UPenn and was in phenomenal shape. So he could play tennis like no one else in the tennis cabinet. So there was, and also he was on board with the ideas that Pinchot had. So you didn't have to be, Roosevelt's best friend. You had to have big ideas and you had to be fit.
So you've written two previous books on Roosevelt, mainly Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, this extraordinary book on the legacy and how Roosevelt's place in American memory has evolved over time. You're writing a book on the tennis cabinet now. So this is part of why you chose this topic. I want to back you up a little bit. So our theme is the athlete in the arena, Roosevelt's role in the development of American sport. So what is that role exactly? And one quick question is, how much did the public know? We know all these things about him. How much did the public know about this sort of club and the strenuous testing of these people?
I think Roosevelt writes at the end of his administration, I don't think anyone will know how important the tennis cabinet was to my administration. So they don't know, and the tarpaulin is a really good way of thinking about that metaphorically and literally, that there's this 20-foot high, obstruction that doesn't let you see. And there's no photographs. I mean, there's tons of photographs of Roosevelt, right? But there's none of him playing his favorite sport. So I'll leave the others that are going to speak about, how Roosevelt developed other sports. But in terms of obscuring the relationship that it has with politics, I think that's the best example I can give you.
So Roosevelt is known as a cowboy. I mean, that metaphor really played out for the rest of his life as a Rough Rider. He's known as a horseman. Does the public know that he boxes in the White House, that he does jiu-jitsu in the White House, that he does stick fighting in the White House? How much of this is general knowledge and how much of this is an inner world that we know because you're a historian?
And because he wanted the world to know that too.
Right.
So it's partly because you can find that stuff easily. He did want people to know that he boxed because it was masculine, and wrestle, and bring sumo wrestlers into the White House and that sort of thing. But this doesn't speak to masculinity. It's not the public image that he wanted to promote, and so that's part of him building his own legacy. And part of it is knowing his audience, I suppose, being a politician. I mean, you and I have talked about this a little bit before. TR, as Elihu Root said in his eulogy, he was a preacher, first and foremost. So if it played with the public, then he was going to do that. And the things that happened behind closed doors, of which we know as historians, digging into the archives and understanding what Theodore Roosevelt was all about, is somewhat different.
I mean, one last question, then I'll turn to the audience, but I know we're talking about Roosevelt and philosophy. So one way of looking at this is that Roosevelt was just a really active, strenuous guy who loved sport, and he made everyone around him conform. And there is that side to it. But not to get in the way of Simon Cordery's talk, but this was an era of urbanization. The frontier was officially declared closed. There was widespread anxiety about what this meant for the American character. So was Roosevelt self-consciously pursuing the strenuous life as an antidote to what he took to be the effeminization of the American population and so on?
Well, I think you said that better than I could say it. Yeah, I would agree with you, and I think Simon will probably speak to some of that. But the idea of strenuosity and duty, dare I say, is also part and parcel of his entire life. So you can read that in early speeches, you can read it in The Strenuous Life, or you can read it in The Man in the Arena when it's 1910 and he's out of the presidency. The idea of over-civilization is an idea that we had become, that we had lost our energy or our vigor, or that we could, even if we hadn't, that we could lose our energy and our vigor as an individual or as a nation, was part and parcel of Roosevelt's idea about evolution, about nationhood and civilization. It's part of his foreign policy as well as his domestic policy.
I guess just one last bit. Did Edith turn him on to tennis, or did he already like tennis and Edith gave him a court?
Ooh, that's a good idea. That's a good question. I don't know.
Because, tennis then wasn't what tennis is now.
Wow.
It's a little bit like lawn tennis or badminton then. It wasn't the heroic thing we see today. Just off the top of your head, you might have thought that Roosevelt would despise tennis as a sissy sport the way he despised golf. But he didn't. As you said, he was a violent tennis player, not particularly a graceful one. But he might have condemned tennis, and he didn't. He got right into it.
So the best story I have about TR playing tennis is the surprise of a young boy playing tennis with him. So this is one of Kermit's friends, a guy called Barclay Farr, whose sister is actually a really important person in American history. But Barclay is a teenager, and he goes to the White House to visit Kermit, and he gets roped into playing a tennis game, and he's paired with Roosevelt. He's paired with the president, and so he's got to serve, and Roosevelt is ducking down in doubles. You duck down so that the other player can serve, and Barclay's losing it because he's thinking, I'm going to hit the president with the ball, and so he just keeps on faulting, and the president yells at him, and then they switch, and the president nearly runs into him. But he left that, obviously feeling quite close to Roosevelt because he nearly got run over by him, but also feeling like that he had learned something about the character of the man as well. And he talks about it throughout his life, actually, that sort of was an inspirational moment for him.
Don't hold back.
Don't hold back.
And a point that Ryan makes in his terrific book is that Ethel, the daughter, was a terrific tennis player and was often a better tennis player than some of the men that she played.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Fabulous.
And so all of these men are differing levels of, and some of them don't play tennis that often. Like Seth Bullock is in that picture. He doesn't play tennis.
Well, which one is Seth?
You can't miss the mustache. He's 3 in from Roosevelt on the right. Yeah.
Excellent.
And-
Questions for our scholar, Michael Cullinane? Yes, here.
Please, there's another man 6th in from the right. William Sewell, down from the North Woods of Maine.
Yep.
And all the way on the left, we know of what occurred on this day and how Seth Bullock teared up and when he pulled the flowers away from the 8th Mr. Proctor statue of the Panther below. All the way on the left, Archibald Butt from the University of the South, also known as Sewanee, died on the Titanic April 15, 1912. Can you speak just quickly to the 50-mile ride to Warrenton and the 50-mile ride back on which Archibald Butt and Admiral Rixey accompanied the president in a blizzard and an ice storm?
Probably not as eloquently as you can, but what I will say about both of those characters is, so Seth Bullock first, you're right, he wells up. He's actually tasked with gifting that cougar or puma, we're not entirely sure what it is, a cat of some sort, to Roosevelt. He tears up and he can't give it to him. So someone else, I think Jusserand in the end, presents so it was an emotional moment. And it wasn't the only moment where all of these, or nearly all of these men met up that day. They went to, later on they went to Garfield's house in Washington, and there's a model of the tennis court there Roosevelt can't come because it's the end of his presidency, but the rest of the tennis cabinet go and meet there. Archie Butt is interesting because he's really the social secretary for Roosevelt towards the end of his term, and so he does, along with the man standing on the far right, William Loeb, who Edith used to call William Loeb. He was the secretary for Roosevelt, and the two men on the extremes of this picture are basically Roosevelt's social secretaries, and they're the only, Roosevelt said, they're the only two that could keep up with me. And they didn't play tennis that frequently, but they were able to keep up dictating letters and organizing Roosevelt, which was a task in itself, a sport in itself.
Yeah, and Archie Butt is a tragic figure twice because he was gallant on the Titanic, then went down and died with it, but he also was caught between Taft and Roosevelt and felt deep loyalty to both, and it tore him apart to see the two of them at odds with each other. And Seth Bullock is sort of the Forrest Gump of this time. I just read today, because I'm looking at the funeral of Edward VII, which TR attended on behalf of Taft. Seth Bullock was there. Seth Bullock turns up in London for the funeral of Edward VII. That's a long way from Deadwood.
I don't know why Roosevelt wanted him there, but he insisted on having Seth Bullock there. And Bullock plays an interesting role here. So he's one of the Greens. I class him as a conservationist, which he is. He's largely on board with Roosevelt's plans. But in this period, why he's important is he's arguing to Roosevelt about how to get rid of this pest in the Black Hills. There's a beetle that bores into trees and leaves a blue path, destroying the timber. The forest rangers couldn't figure out how to get rid of this, and Bullock begins to. At that time he is the superintendent of the Black Hills Forest, and he figures out a way to stop the infestation, mainly by stripping the bark off the trees. So that's the role that he plays there. He doesn't frequently go to play tennis, but he's part of that club.
Other questions here? Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your insight and revelation. But it's interesting when you say you don't know on some of these questions. Who in the devil would try to know why on a wedding date or an anniversary he would climb the Matterhorn?
Yeah, so he climbed the Matterhorn on his honeymoon. You have any explanation for that except it was possible?
I mean, he does lots of things. His wife is sick and he goes off to war.
He said he would have left her deathbed to
Right.
go off to Cuba.
I mean, this is a man that's got a determination that I can't understand because myself, but.
The other thing, there were no photographs of that, or I'm not sure if there were boxing.
We don't have a boxing photo. We have him in boxing attire, but not wearing gloves.
Or there was a screen up so they don't see him in his stylish tennis cars, celebrities do now.
So as to the Matterhorn, it's also the case that he was one of the first 20 people ever to climb it. The age of mountaineering was just beginning, and so it's even more astonishing that he climbed it on his honeymoon when it wasn't a routine thing the way it would be in our own time. I mean, clearly he was testing himself constantly through his life, pushing himself, taking his father's challenge seriously. My son, you must make your body. And it mattered to him in every possible way to prove that he had the right stuff.
Yes, but let's take this with a grain of salt, too. Theodore Roosevelt also dies at 60. He has immense health problems as a result of pushing himself this far, whether it's in Brazil, or getting malaria twice, or, there's lessons to take from this, that, duty and strife and toil and labor are important if we want to accomplish anything. But we also don't want to take that to the extreme either, which in some ways we can see that Theodore Roosevelt does. So I think this is a good example of learning lessons from the past, both as what to do and what to avoid.
But if he were here, and in some sense he is, he would punch you in the snout. I mean, if you gave him the choice, you can live to be 90 and take it easy, or you can live to be 60 and lead a crazy, reckless, heroic life. There's no question in his mind.
Would you cheer if Theodore Roosevelt punched me in the nose right now? I would hope we've gotten beyond that. I would hope that someone would get up and tackle Theodore Roosevelt if he punched me in the nose. Joe? Yeah.
I won't take the bait, but I believe I've read that Theodore Roosevelt explained in a letter that the reason he climbed the Matterhorn was because at the hotel they were staying at, there were some English chaps who had climbed the mountain the day before.
Right.
And he wanted to show that a Yank could climb just as well as they could.
Absolutely.
Could you speak to the use of sport and the presidency? Some fellow coined the phrase the bully pulpit. And sport as a way to communicate to the American people. I'm thinking of hosting John L. Sullivan at the White House for a quasi-exhibition of boxing because Sullivan had become, he went dry, he went sober. And secondly, never to have thrown out a first pitch. We really do credit Archibald Butt with getting Taft to do that for the Washington Senators. But what about hosting, for example, the Cleveland Nats, the Washington Senators, the New York Highlanders at the White House, hosting the championship teams? Do we know, did that originate under Roosevelt? I don't.
Showcasing successful athletes and teams in the White House.
I mean, he certainly showcases athletes by promoting them and promoting their sports. I can't speak to to how far and vast or what specifics around what sports. I mean, we know that he didn't like baseball, and that he supported reforms in football. I mean, those things I can tell you, but I know we've got
Ryan in the morning.
We've
yeah.
got 3 other scholars that are going to tell us much more, and I'm hoping to learn a lot from that, answer some of those questions that I just don't know.
Let's do a few more. Yes. Yes, please. Yes, you.
I love your talk. I'm wondering if you could speak to just your thoughts on whether TR, like, how does he set a precedent for presidents, I don't know, playing sport in public or using sport as a kind of solace or respite in private, but I'm thinking of someone like Ronald Reagan, who seems to be both and uses his sports to be both, like signing his famous tax cut, wearing like the Canadian tuxedo on his ranch, very close purposely, but then also, taking that family time, or Obama with basketball.
To what extent was he setting precedents for presidents exhibiting sportingness?
I think he's probably, the reason why we call him our first modern president, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is because he uses the press to his advantage. So he's conscious. Just the reasons why he's not showing himself playing tennis is the same reason why he allows photos taken of him climbing rocks in Rock Creek Park. So he's conscious of that, just are all of the others. It's why Boris Johnson running is really awkward to watch. So he just, he hops out of a car and then he runs 2 feet to the front door. The press are there to capture that, and he looks like a buffoon. Roosevelt was manufacturing that. Ronald Reagan was, George Bush. The reason why he only showed some of his mountain biking was because some of it was incredibly dangerous. And if you had seen it as a citizen, you would have thought, well, is my president going to die on a mountain bike trail? So a lot of this is manufactured, and I think TR is the first modern president, not to harness public opinion, but to start to manage it in a contemporary way, or one that we can think of today in our own time.
But even more than that, he became the first cowboy president, and he was a cowboy, a genuine cowboy in a certain sense. And then we have Ronald Reagan self-consciously following in that mold, G.W. Bush clearing a little brush down in Texas. We have LBJ doing much the same thing, and they all figured out that being a cowboy president works. So her question is sort of, did Roosevelt think of this as a way to connect more broadly than in his political focus?
Oh, absolutely, and it is the same as that. I mean, it's the reason why presidents talk about growing up in log cabins, is that it creates an image of them being relatable, of them being strenuous in this case. So it's all wrapped up in the public image, yeah.
A couple more questions. Yes, here. Yes, please.
Did sport to any degree have any relationship with Congress and its relationship with members of Congress, with that branch of the government?
Sport and Congress, tennis and congressmen.
I don't know if any Congress people were invited to play tennis, and I don't think there are no Congress people in that photo. So it's a different kind of combat sport, the executive and legislative battles, but I don't think it's a sporting one, or at least to my knowledge. I'd have to check that if I'm honest.
But there were non-government types in the tennis cabinet. Owen Wister, there were some that were kind of honorary members.
Owen Wister's not really part of the, he's intellectually, Roosevelt and Wister, they're speaking about all manner of things, but he's not playing tennis with them, and he's not invited. Owen Wister's not invited to this party. So when Roosevelt, at the end of his term, I think that's why it's important. This is where the research began, is why are these 30 people, most of which I don't know, why are they the ones that are invited to lunch? Why isn't Wister there? Why isn't Elihu Root invited to lunch? Why is it these 30? And he says, after he leaves the White House, I don't think anyone will know how important these people are. And they haven't been looked at yet.
Last chance. Yes, in the back.
I hate taking a question away when we can just chat about the city time, Mike. You talked about the tennis cabinet's relationship to Roosevelt. Was there any cross-pollination between the other members of the tennis cabinet within themselves? Did the Wonks talk to the Greens?
Yeah, when they worked with TR, were they cross-pollinating?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of leaders amongst this group as well that are really tight. So the 3 leaders that I would point out are James R. Garfield, Gifford Pinchot, who I didn't speak of, and Jules Jusserand. Jusserand becomes the dean of the diplomatic corps after Julien Pauncefote dies, and the English sort of, they're no longer the center of gravity in Washington, D.C. It moves up to Adams Morgan, where the French are. Gifford Pinchot and James Garfield used to wake up in the morning, walk out of their houses, find each other, walk to work together, either at the executive office or nearby, and then they would go together and play tennis with the president. They were constantly talking, constantly scheming about what could be done to make reforms, the things that they wanted to see reformed. And there's others too. There's other clubs that are involved. The Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. is a fertile ground for ideas that Pinchot is found at, and many of these other people as well. James Bronson Reynolds in New York clubs as well. There's another guy up there called Francis Ellington Layup or Loop, or we're not Loop. He's a New Yorker, and there's other New Yorkers that are meeting in New York when they're not in Washington. So there is a lot of things that are going on amongst these individuals that are helping then lead to decisions made at the White House.
Let's do one more question. Yes.
You talked about how he said, I don't think people will know how important the tennis cabinet was. Do you think that was a regret? Do you think he wished he had let people know?
Did he wish that more people knew about the tennis cabinet?
Well, that kind of goes back to Ann's question in a way, too. Is he queuing us up for something there? Is he saying that to reporters? Because he was very purposeful when he spoke to reporters. Is he saying that because he wants us to know who these people are? And later on, actually, it's Pinchot and Garfield that write a mini biography of Roosevelt and how important the tennis cabinet is. Never been published, and should be, because it's quite good about the inner workings of the. So I think he might have been queuing this up, but no one's taken the cue so far.
Wait a minute. These two wrote a book about TR and tennis,
With his approval. No, not about tennis, about the administration.
and this has never been published.
No.
Well, we should publish it. That's what the TR Center should do.
Okay, but it's not a biography, and it's not refined.
But it'd be interesting, don't you think?
It would be interesting, yeah. It is interesting, I've read it.
Let's get after this.
Okay, we can do that.
This is fantastic. All right, so a great start. We are so glad that you are the Rob and Melanie Walton Endowed Chair of Theodore Roosevelt Studies here at Dickinson State University. You'll be with us all fall physically, in the spring metaphysically. We're hoping this is a long and fruitful association. We really are glad you've set the tone for everything that follows. There will be a book signing immediately following in the foyer. There are 4 books for sale here. This book, your other book of reminiscences, Ryan Swanson's book, The Strenuous Life, which is one of the things that inspired this symposium, and then if you have nothing else to do in the world, my book, The Language of Cottonwood's Essays on the Future of North Dakota. I represented it before 150 Lutherans in Medora the other day, and it was like the humanities as a contact sport. So we'll start in the lobby, but then let's go down to the Alumni House and have a beautiful reception. Thank you, Michael Cullinane.